Hi and welcome to the RedLore Material Tracking Podcast. In this podcast, we are interviewing thought leaders in the field of material tracking. Each monthly episode focuses on a specific topic within the domain of the thought leader, who is interviewed by our CEO Nick van der Donk. Topics vary from automatic tracking of materials in the factory to tracking reusable containers across the supply chain, to guarding the chain of custody of sensitive goods, and much more. Here at RedLore, these topics are at the heart of what we do, helping our customers boost their productivity. Let's dive right into this episode.
Welcome to the fifth episode of our podcast on industrial material tracking. In the previous editions, we explored technologies and business benefits of tracking materials in manufacturing and warehousing with the help of industry leaders, researchers, and experts. Today, we'll be delving into the intriguing world of reusable bulk packaging. And who better to help us with that than Bianca Robinson, Chief Innovation Officer at South Africa's Alpal and winner of the 2024 Design Innovation Award for Excellence in Reusable Packaging. Welcome, Bianca.
Hello, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Bianca, could you introduce yourself?
So as Nick said, I'm Bianca, and I'm from a company called Alpal. At Alpal, we specialize in bulk reusable packaging, which we'll dive into more detail on during the course of the podcast. My role is around spearheading our company's vision, which is to transform supply chains for circular efficiencies. And so, as we'll discuss in greater detail in due course, the premise for this role at the moment lies in building a services model around the Alpal product, and that is centered on supply chain visibility and insights driven by tracking and tracing technology.
And I'd love to dive into that in more detail. But first, your company Alpal, as you said, you're an innovator in reusable bulk packaging, more specifically reusable containers and pallet boxes. What applications are you targeting?
So maybe just to clarify, Alpal is effectively a 2-in-1 pallet and box system. So for those who are not familiar with the space, if you had to imagine a bulk corrugated box on a wooden pallet, that's effectively what Alpal seeks to displace. And so if you think of those containers, those applications are very broad, but particularly often related to dry goods. And that's the area where Alpal historically and currently has had the most focus. But our particular focus has been around seed, fresh produce, frozen product, plastic resin. Those are some of the industries that we've got some deep expertise and experience in, although we're obviously not limited to those by any means. And then excitingly, we've recently relaunched a new product, which is a liquid Alpal. And that unit has the ability to store and transport liquids as viscous as honey or tomato paste, or something like water or a combination of solids and water, depending on your particular application. So it's very broad, but at the same time can be very niche.
Got it. And you're an innovator in this space. Before your product came around, what is the sort of the incumbent way of packaging? What's the old school way of doing things?
Yep. So what we found is the incumbent packaging typically is designed for one of two benefits. Either it's for storage optimization, which would be a result of its rigidity, which enables a packaging unit to stack. So, for example, a wooden crate. In another instance, packaging can be designed for collapsibility, which aids return transport efficiencies. And a good example of that is your corrugated box, which can very easily be collapsed, optimize your return transport efficiencies. So Alpal is quite unique in that it's the design, and that's where you mentioned that award, that's where the genius of the design lies, is that it has the ability to do both. So it has the rigidity to both stack 6 high and in so doing optimize your storage. But it also has the ability to collapse in a 5-to-1 empty return ratio and in so doing maximize your return transport efficiencies. And so that's how we are differentiated from the existing market. And then in terms of competitive solutions or solutions that lie in the reusable space, so just to be clear, corrugated boxes can be reusable, and they just typically aren't as reusable as ours. So a corrugated box might be reused for 2 to 3 occasions. In our customer base, we've had certain users using our units in excess of 10 years. So there's a very wide variety when it comes to reusability. In terms of other reusable bulk packaging solutions, three of the key benefits of Alpal is, most importantly, that it has a modular design. So in the event that you have damages to the units, instead of having to replace the whole unit, you are able to replace components, which is a benefit when you're looking at the cost of a packaging unit. Alpal is also differentiated in its price point. So we've been able to design it in such a way that it's very competitive price-wise, which is another differentiating factor. And then the third factor that differentiates the unit, it's ease of assembly. So it's very easy to assemble, both assemble and disassemble. And so that aids in handling time and reduces labor costs, which is a big advantage.
Okay, so let me unpack that a little bit. There's a lot there. Let me unpack it a little bit to see if I'm understanding it correctly. You mentioned that the incumbent solution is either a corrugated box or something like a wooden crate. And a corrugated box is great for return efficiency because you can collapse it, very collapsible, but it's not stackable. And on the other hand, wooden crates, they can stack, but it's horrible for return because it doesn't collapse. It's very, very bulky. You're basically shipping air. You mentioned something like the return ratio. I'm not sure I got that right. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
So in terms of your return ratio to the one you've particularly mentioned, in that case, wooden crates, historically, in applications that are using packaging like wooden crates, they are returning those wooden crates empty. And so in effect, transporting air because they cannot be collapsed. So actually, perhaps the best way to describe that is by means of a use case. So we have a customer who's in the frozen produce space, and they use wooden crates. And by means of switching to Alpals, as a result of configuration changes, footprint changes, as well as payload of the packaging units and how we place those in that truck, that resulted in us being able to increase their outbound storage volume by 9%. So put another way, each truck was carrying 9% more product on the outbound leg. On the return leg, so that's just to say there's actually an outbound benefit over and above just the return transport efficiencies that I've already mentioned, particularly with reference to the return transport efficiencies because of the collapsibility of the Alpal unit. In that particular use case, we saw an 83% reduction in return trips. And so for us just to be able to conceptualize that, what that means is for every 6 trucks previously returning to the DC or the central facility, now they only needed 1 truck. And so you can just imagine the impact of having 1 truck as opposed to 6 trucks on the road. Obviously, your fuel savings are drastic, your labor savings are drastic, depreciation on your trucks. So there's a huge economical benefit inherent in that value. And then interestingly, from a sustainability perspective, there's also enormous value in that you can imagine the reduction in carbon emissions as a result of those reduced return trips. So that's an example on the collapsibility side. To maybe drive home the value of the storage efficiencies that we often see as a result of the stackability. So in a corrugated box example, users can typically stack those 2, maybe 3 high if it's a very high-end product. The challenge with corrugated boxes is the integrity of the unit is dependent on the handling. So the weather that it's been subject to, if it's been filled with moisture and therefore its strength is compromised. Units also have to be filled with product. You can't stack with a box half filled, else obviously the actual box is not carrying the weight. The product, interestingly, is carrying the weight, which is an interesting mind shift or perspective on when you realize your product's actually carrying the weight of your product. Whereas in our instance, our packaging is carrying the weight of the product. And so we maybe, again, by means of use case, because I think those are always helpful for driving home and explaining the benefit and value. We had a particular customer in the seed space who had reached capacity in their warehouse. And so they were looking at building an additional warehouse. And you can obviously imagine the cost involved in building a whole new facility like that. And it was at that point that they engaged with us as Alpal, learned that basically instead of needing to build a whole nother warehouse, they could utilize our packaging to increase their storage capacity. So in that instance, they were stacking 2 high. And so now they could instantly stack 6 high, which means they instantly tripled their storage space. It sounds crazy, but it's reality. So they instantly tripled their storage space because they're utilizing air or ceiling space that was previously wasted. Another way of putting it is that there was a 300% more storage available. So not only does that eliminate the cost that would have been involved in building a warehouse, or the cost involved in third-party logistics providers where they were needing to store product, particularly in high harvest seasons. They're not only eliminating those direct costs, but now they're reducing their cost per kg of product stored. So for every square meter in a warehouse, you are storing 3 times more product. With that, it means you're spreading your utility costs of that warehouse across 3 times more product. And again, that provides a sustainability benefit because now you have energy efficiency. You're using the same amount of carbon to store 3 times more product. So therefore, by calculation, less carbon emissions in theory. So those are just 2 examples of the benefit of Alpal, particularly from an efficiency perspective in comparison to the incumbent packaging. And when we talk about efficiency, those are the 2 key drivers in return transport or in storage capacity.
Understood. That's very clear. And at some point, you also mentioned the environmental benefit. How do your customers react to that? Is it a sufficient condition for customers to engage with you? What's the role of the environmental aspect in the dynamics with the customer?
Yes, so that's a great question, Nick, and I'm so glad you asked it because sustainability has been for a while a massive talking point and a priority on the agenda, so to speak. But in recent times, particularly in Europe, there's been a move, at least from my perspective, from awareness to action. So previously where there was a lot of awareness around sustainability, now there's this call to action. And so just by way of example, earlier in February, the European Commission passed legislation that's called the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation. And particularly in relation to transport packaging, which is how our packaging is defined, it has 3 requirements that it stipulates that all European operators will need to abide by. 1 is that the packaging has to be reusable. 2 is that it has to be recyclable. And 3 is that it has to be made of minimum recycled content. And so from a sustainability perspective, Alpal sits in a sweet spot in that we are by design reusable, we are by design recyclable, and we're currently in the beta and testing phase of a recycled content unit. So a unit that's made from previously utilized plastics rather than virgin material. And so we do have customers that approach us where their core need is sustainability. But even in those instances, it's imperative that we are never sustainable for the sake of sustainability. And that's because that's not sustainable. So maybe just to say that again, sustainability for the sake of sustainability is not sustainable. And we want sustainability to be sustainable. And we believe in sustainability. And so for that purpose, when our customers approach us from a sustainability lens, we always want to make sure that there's an economic and commercial value in their transition to a unit like ours. Some of that's driven by the examples that I gave you previously. There's other drivers, for example, health and safety or standardization in the unit, platform innovation, which we're going to chat about more. That's a big driver of value and return on investment. But I think the misconception is that sustainability is expensive. Sustainability is a grudge. purchase, or it's a necessary requirement that's imposed on us. And at Alpal, we see the opposite. We see sustainability as a means of driving return, driving value, and driving financial gain.
Gotcha. And now we're on the topic of gain, benefits, economics. What do the economics look like? Do you have some experience with return on investment, the numbers behind the gain?
Yep. So the way that we look at it is by comparing your cost per use. We would look at your cost per use of your existing packaging compared to your cost of use in our case. And so what that helps us derive is a payback period, which is the period in which you will recover your capital investment into an asset like this. It also then indicates, obviously within a defined period, if you've paid it off, for example, if it's 5 years and you've paid it off in year one, which is what we often see to be the case, just because the efficiencies can be so extreme to the examples I gave you earlier, then in a 5-year period, your remaining 4 years is simply return. Your packaging is not costing you anything. And so that's how we look at justifying an investment into packaging of this nature, is understanding in comparison to your existing packaging, what is your payback period, and then subsequently, what is your return on investment given the comparative cost.
Good. And what have you seen in practice in terms of realistic payback times?
Yep. So, I mean, it's obviously very variable depending on specific circumstances, how many units an organization has. A big driver of your return on investment or payback period is your cycle time. What we mean by cycle time is the point from which an Alpal unit leaves its point of origination and returns. So it's been sent out full with product and it's been returned empty. So depending on that cycle time, that determines how many reuses a unit can have in an annum, in a year, for example, per annum. So if your cycle time is 3 months, in theory, that might mean you can turn that asset 4 times in a year. So 3 times 4 is 12 months. And so if you can move an asset 4 times in a year, in theory, you need 4 times less number of units of packaging to transport the same volume of product. So it's very dependent on the cycle times, the number of reuses. It's also dependent on how long product needs to sit in storage for. So in some instances, people can stack 6 high. In other instances, there might be limitations in how high they can stack. So it's very variable. But recently, we've interestingly most often seeing it payback within year 1, maybe year 2, but predominantly in year 1 because the efficiencies are so great.
Understood. Let's move on to the topic of tracking. Material tracking is at the heart of this podcast. It's also what we do at RedLore. We help manufacturers, warehousers track everything there is on their shop floor across different sites that they're operating across to customers. We tell them where things are, what condition they're in. So when we use the word tracking, at least at RedLore, it means the methods and the technology to know where everything is and what condition it's in. And condition can be temperature for temperature sensitive goods. You mentioned produce, Bianca, can mean physical damage, can mean utilization patterns, and so on and so on. Bianca, could you please speak to the benefits of tracking in the applications that you're tackling?
Sure. So this is an area that I'm particularly passionate about, and it's at the heart of, like I said, my role and my vision for Alpal. And so ultimately, tracking enables us as Alpal to achieve our vision. And I mentioned that previously, our vision being to transform supply chains for circular efficiencies. And so there are 3 core elements in our vision that you might have picked up on there. One is transformation, one is circularity, and one is efficiency. And so when it comes to transformation, the ability to embed technology in our units means that we're able to provide visibility and insights that were never possible before. And I say never possible before because with units like a corrugated box, investing in technology is prohibitively expensive. It's also not practical because those units have a very limited useful life, if not being a single-use unit. And so the reusable nature of the Alpal enables us to invest in technology to provide this visibility. And so we effectively see it as a supply chain now having eyes and ears on all their packaging units within their supply chain. And so that's eyes and ears that they haven't had before. That's feeding back information around what they're seeing and hearing. That provides enormous power for transforming a supply chain. Because when you've got the data and insights, that's when you have the means to change and improve and optimize and drive efficiencies. And so from a transformation perspective, that's one of our big drivers is that visibility. Additionally, I've alluded to it before, but our units are assets. They're not an expense. And packaging historically and most commonly sits as an expense item. And so the reusable nature is what drives the asset value of the unit. But when we're able to add technology to the unit, we are extending the value beyond just the function of the unit. And in one sense, able to generate more dividends on the investment into our packaging unit. And so we see tracking as a way of sweating our assets, if you want to look at it from a financial perspective, in that it enables us to get more out of our assets, and that aids in this process of transformation. In terms of circularity, I mentioned PPWR, the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation. I personally don't believe that legislation like that at the European level would be possible with the absence of technology. And the reason I say that is because it's not just a case of the requirements, but it's a case of proving those requirements. So you have to prove the reusability or prove that a unit has met the definition of reusability, which in that case may mean that you need to prove the cycle time, or you need to prove the number of reuses of an asset or the life of an asset. And so having the tracking capability on our assets means we have those data points to be able to do that, and to be able to do that seamlessly, which is critical given our intention to be driving circularity. And then from an efficiencies perspective, what's interesting there is that, like we've spoken about, the models that we run that help us determine the value of an investment for our customers. By having tracking technology, we can now gather the actual data and put that back in those estimate models and compare estimate versus actuals. And so in essence, prove the return on investment or guarantee the Alpal performance, which becomes quite exciting. And so those are the three core areas that tracking is really exciting for us and has the potential to transform our business, where we can now have the opportunity to offer services like this to our customers.
So that would mean that instead of selling a product, you would sell a service, and you would bill for the service in lockstep with the value that you generate for your customer.
Yeah, so long-term vision, big thinking might be, in time, what if we gave our units to customers for free and we monetize the efficiencies, or the storage efficiencies, or we monetize the return transport efficiencies. So that's our long-term dream and big picture thinking, and tracking technology enables us to make that a reality. In the medium term, we obviously offering value to our customers beyond just the product itself, aiding in services that they require. But given packaging is not core to their business, it's very difficult for them to dedicate resources, capex, time, etc., to establishing. And so we're in a position where we can provide that service for our customers, which is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so adding trackability to your products will enable you to move to that services model. I'd like to circle back to one of the first things you mentioned when we talked about tracking, which was transform the supply chain, and through that transformation provide new insights. Could you give a few concrete examples of what those insights could look like? What exactly will they be able to improve after they receive the insights from the tracking? Could you give some
Yeah,
examples?
sure. Yep. So this is what's really exciting is, for example, if we are tracking units, we'll be able to see how they're being shipped, where they're being shipped, and then you might be able to pick up a trend where this particular shipping route is constantly delayed. And in which case we now have the data to say, okay, there's enough basis to warrant using an alternate shipping route, even if that potentially is slightly more expensive, because that extra cost outweighs the cost and the customer reputation damage inherent in shipping delays. So that's one example. Another example is with tracking and tracing. You have real-time visibility into where your units are, either within your facilities or even globally. And so that aids with demand forecasting. You can then very confidently reposition units as they're required. And inherent in that is a level of control over your packaging assets that you would otherwise not have. Or control that's sitting in invoices and documents and systems and processes that you've got to dig really deep to find. And once you found it, it's unhelpful. At that point, you've missed the burning platform. So that's another example, is around control of your fleet, visibility into where your units are so that you can effectively forecast demand. Another exciting one, which everyone loves, is obviously insight into your suppliers and their performance, and objective means of insight. So I guess for suppliers, it can be scary, and I've heard instances where suppliers have offered a service like this to their customers, and then it's exposed their warts and they've decided to pull back on solutions like that. We want to be transparent and open about the performance of our units, and carry the responsibility for where they are coming short, because we want to be constantly improving. We want to be constantly innovating. And so we see it as an opportunity above all else. So supplier performance management is interesting. You suddenly have something that's called a digital product passport. So you have a passport for your asset. You know over its useful life, this is where it's been, this is what it's been exposed to, this is when it's been in and out of service. And I just think that's invaluable for creating opportunity for improving your operations and an opportunity for innovation, because then you can see bottlenecks in your supply chain. And so just on that, one last point is the other enormous benefit is the opportunity that tracking creates for building digital twins. So because you've now got the data on what's happening, you can build your virtual representation of that packaging unit and the packaging unit in its environment. And that just provides a further granularity of insight into what's happening and next time's opportunity for optimization and innovation in your systems and processes.
Got you. Yes. And the topic of having the right amount of packaging available at the right time is something that I experienced personally. I was then the producer, and I couldn't produce because I didn't have the right packaging, and I couldn't deliver in time to my customer, even if they were holding on to the empty packaging. It still was detrimental for both of us because there was no production happening as a result. And I'd also like to circle back to, I think it was the first interview we did in this series with Bridget Growal from Magna, a large automotive parts manufacturer, which revolved exactly around this idea: know where your packaging is, because if you don't have enough of it when you need it and where you need it, then basically your supply chain grinds to a halt.
And that's this interesting dynamic where packaging is typically seen as a grudge purchase, as a necessary evil. And so people are reluctant to invest in it or give time to it. But the whole value proposition when it comes to reusability has now flipped that on its head. And so now you're sitting with packaging that's an asset. It's not an expense. And with that comes the need to look after it. But with that makes you realize just how valuable the packaging is. To your point, exactly. On the one hand, we see it as a necessary evil. On the other hand, if you don't have it, your supply chain grinds to a halt. And how devastating to think that you would forfeit sales purely because you haven't been able to forecast demand accurately. And so this is where, that tracking technology becomes so powerful, is it provides a whole new level of confidence and security around your ability to deliver.
Okay, excellent. What would be your advice to a company who wants to look into innovative bulk packaging and tracking? What would be your advice to them as to how to approach the subject, how to get into the business of reusable bulk packaging? What are the do's? What are the don'ts?
Absolutely. So for me, the starting point is always taking a step back and sitting down and analyzing what are the key challenges that you're solving for. It's absolutely imperative that you're crystal clear on what the challenges are with your packaging, either from a function perspective or from a visibility perspective as it relates to tracking opportunity. And so that for me is always the starting point, because I think often we can rush into solutions without being clear on what the problem we're solving for is. But if we're clear on the problem that we're solving for, it also gives us flexibility to let go of solutions that we've possibly invested in but haven't worked, because we're still on the right path to solving for the problem. So that would be the first one, is to be clear on your list of challenges. And then within that, to prioritize what's your number one problem that you're solving for. Because we can't solve for everything at once, and there has to be a starting point. And I think often we try and solve for everything at once, or we try to bite off more than we can chew. Instead of eating the elephant one bite at a time, we want to eat the whole thing in one go. And when we're unable to do that, then projects like this fall flat, because it's just not possible. And so that would be another point of advice, would be to say, be clear on the problem that you're solving for and prioritize that problem in the face of other opportunities that present themselves. In this particular instance, especially in combining tracking capability with packaging, and given the sustainability benefit involved in our reusable packaging, our packaging touches on a number of areas within business. And so what we've seen to be valuable is to bring in different stakeholders across the business as this may impact. So for example, bring in operations if it's related to operations and improving efficiencies. Bring in sustainability if there's a sustainability drive. Bring in IT if there's room for tracking and tracing to be able to get their specific insight and feedback. Bring in your supply chain team. Equally so, bring in a variety of seniority, because this will impact both tracking, and the packaging itself will impact a variety of seniority within an organization. So it will impact the person on the ground that's physically handling the unit, and it will equally impact the exec who's looking at how this is driving return or benefits for their organization. And so we found it to be really helpful to gather those stakeholders in a team that cumulatively looks at solutions of this nature. Then, like I mentioned before, sustainability is not sustainable if it's only considered for the sake of sustainability. And so the same applies to digital solutions. It's not sustainable if you're just looking at implementing a digital solution for the sake of it being digital, or implementing a reusable packaging solution for the sake of being reusable. There has to be financial value that makes it economically viable for the organization. And so running models like the ones we do to understand what is your payback period, what's your return on investment, how does this aid the bottom line of your organization so that this can be a sustainable innovation and improvement in the long term. And that's key, is that all of these are typically long-term, medium to long-term in nature. There's not an immediate gain. It takes time. And so that's a critical point, is having that perspective in terms of the time frame. And then some other do's, like I've mentioned before, is the big picture, keeping the big picture in mind. There needs to be a fundamental mind shift around, in this case, particularly packaging as an expense to packaging as an asset. And when you see packaging as an asset, it changes the whole rhetoric around packaging and your investment into that packaging, both from an intelligence perspective and from a function perspective. And we see that change is one of the biggest obstacles to adopting solutions of this nature. And so the courage to change is critical, because there's a requirement to stand up against the stagnant tide of what's always been. And so there's a level of patience and resilience and humility that's required to take on that challenge. And so that's that would be probably the biggest point overall, is to be able to have the courage to stand firm in the face of innovation and the face of improvement.
Be an innovator, not a laggard. Yeah. Well, thank you very much,
Exactly.
Bianca, for helping us understand the importance of reusable bulk packaging. I think your messages were very, very clear. Your explanations were very straightforward to understand. And thank you, dear listener, for tuning into this episode. We always welcome your comments. Feel free to leave them at the bottom. If you want to reach out to us directly, either to Alpal or to RedLore, we'll leave the contact information under the podcast as well. We're hoping to hear from you soon.
We hope you liked this episode. If you like the podcast content we're bringing, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. At RedLore, we help manufacturing and logistics companies address visibility issues within their material flows and manufacturing processes. Our wireless tags accurately monitor the on-site location of materials as well as their condition, such as temperature deviations and damage. Our solution also tracks the material carries such as totes and racks within the manufacturing site and across sites. It replaces time-consuming and error-prone barcode scanning. It brings you real-time location and condition monitoring, which an older technology like RFID cannot do. The end result is that our solution helps our customers avoid line stops, inventory discrepancies, inefficiencies due to human error, and keeps track of the chain of custody. If you'd like to hear more about the topic addressed in this or in previous episodes, just send us an email at info@redlore.com and we'll be in touch.